Hi, this is Megalithic Maiden Jj Ainsworth, and I'm continuing Chapter 1, Part 2 of The Shining Ones by Christian and Barbara Joy O'Brien. That I should dearly love to have been able to claim that honor goes without saying, but the discovery of Chogazambil belongs to Bolu alone. A man who had the knowledge to recognize what he saw, enthusiasm to ride 50 miles on horseback to a place cuneiform inscribed brick before the archaeological mission at Shush. The ziggurat, the tower to the sky, was then a grass-covered mound about 100 feet in height, with the occasional cuneiform inscribed brick sticking out of the muddy runnels formed by the recent rains. When I saw it last, in 1969, it stood proudly partially restored, brick tier upon brick tier, a magnificent monument to the skills and spiritual aspirations of a people who lived over 3,000 years ago. Now who knows? Uncovered and exposed to the violent winter rains, having been surrounded by the ravage of a savage war, and hostage to the Ayatollah's uncaring regime, since it predates the critical birth of Islam by 2,000 years, and therefore probably has little relevance in fundamentalist countries. The remainder of its life may now be short. It will probably collapse into the same chaotic jumble of bricks and mud-shaped in form 60 years ago. The grass will grow on its rain-smooth slopes, and it will sink once more into a limbo of neglect until its memory is only kept alive by the literature that describes its past glories. My enthusiasm for the cultural achievements of the early civilizations of the Mesopotamian Valley was born in the sunrise of that November morning 56 years ago, and augmented by the sensitive interest of my wife, who later learned to love Iran and its people as I did. That enthusiasm has grown steadily with the passing years. It was to the spur urged me, over 50 years later, to attempt to reconstruct the past from the Sumerian Karsag tablets. Because of this, I am happy to honor the sentiments of Andrei Parer, who worked long hours among these widespread but prolific ruins and helped to uncover many of their treasures, including the beautiful Mary statue of Ninhursag, the great lady of Karsag, who will play a major role in the early chapters of this work. In his book, Sumer, the Dawn of Art, Paret pondered on the remarkable advances in civilization that had been made in that valley by the 3rd millennium BC, and wrote the following memorable lines. Now that we can view the Mesopotamian basin in all its splendor, it is becoming clear that this flame which blazed up so suddenly as in the Middle East, and shed so wide a light, was kindled at several points, each with its own nuance and distinctive luster. Susa, Lagash, Uruk, Ashnunak, Nineveh, Mary, all alike were centers whose civilization advanced from strength to strength until at last, thanks to the genius of the few and the boldness of many, there wrought forth, as in alchemist's crucible, a prodigious, many-sided art. We shall hope to demonstrate, out of the writings of the Sumerians themselves, that those few were the shining ones whose genius was not of this earth. One of the problems still faced by students of prehistory and the Mesopotamian Valley is to determine the origins of the Sumerians who ruled supreme from at least the 4th millennium BC and probably through to the 5th, until the rise of the Agad dynasty under the domination of the Semitic king Sargon I in the middle of the 3rd millennium. There is no archaeological evidence for the immigration of any recognizable race or nation to explain the sudden rise of the culture of the indigenous people to a blossoming civilization. The Sumerians themselves are not considered by scholars to have contributed to an acceptable solution because their writings attributed all progress to their gods. Strangely, to our way of thinking, this attribution, made over and over again in paeans of unmistakable praise, is still not acceptable to those scholarly pundits. And yet, as established in the first part of our prologue, the early Hebrews also attributed their achievements to their gods, the Elohim, or Shining Ones. And so did the Old Irish and the Teutonic races, as well as the ancestors of the Amerindians, the Asian Indians peoples, the Persians, the Chinese, the Japanese, and many other cultures. To demonstrate which is the purpose of this worldwide study, the question has to be addressed: had these gods really existed? Had they assisted in the development of mankind, unsuspected and unhonored by modern prehistorians and scholars? In this quest, we found that we needed fresh skills in order to study this arcane influence. So we turned to languages such as Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, and even Gaelic where it was required. We studied ancient tablets from Nippur that had not been touched in 100 years, and unearthed Hebrew books that, until a few years ago, had not been available for study for more than 15 centuries. Gradually, like Descartes, our doubts crystallized. We were not sure that we were right, but we were as sure as we were of our own existence that scholars, over many millennia, had gone very wrong. In taking the path that they had, scholars had established concepts as truths that should never have been placed in the receptive minds of uncritical men. Chapter 2, Eastward in Eden. This perfect Eden has abundant water, in Herzog, Karsog, Epic No. 1. All modern concepts of the Garden in Eden stem from a few verses in the biblical book of Genesis, none of which is entirely free from ambiguity. The ancient Hebrew documents from which the early part of the book was compiled contain simple and basic writing with very few vowels and none of the modifying inflections that later gave flexibility to the language. The absence of vowels led to much of this ambiguity, which is why even today, after millennia of scholarship, no one knows how the name of the Hebrew God was pronounced. As a result, our churches vary in their interpretation of the original name Yahweh, Yad-He Vav-He, between the sounds of Yahweh and those of Jehovah, and these are only the two of the many possibilities. Another source of ambiguity lies in the fact that early Middle Eastern languages lent heavily on parvnomazia to give variety to simple phrases, a form of punning which allowed several different meanings to be given to a single set of characters. In speech, it is probable that slight inflections of tone differentiated between meanings, but in the written word there is no such indication to assist the translator. Modern students of such languages, like their predecessors, have to guess at the meanings of many words and phrases from the angle of their own preconceived notions of the context. As a result, in all three basic ancient Middle Eastern languages, Hebrew, Sumerian, and Akkadian Babylonian, a scholar with a secular bias is likely to produce a different translation of the same text from that produced by a scholar with a religious interest. This was evident in the discussion in the prologue, from which it is apparent that the simple term Elohim means God to the religious scholar, but the Shining Ones to those of a secular persuasion. The Old Testament does not specify who or what these Shining Ones were, but fortunately the ancient Sumerian records do, and certain alternative Hebrew documents, which are not well understood by biblical scholars today, provide confirmatory evidence of a remarkable kind. Another trap which must be mentioned here lies in the Hebrew word which scholars have translated as the heavens. This was Hashemim, a plural form indicating the skies, like the Sumerian term on, which was used for skies or for high places. The Hebrew term could also mean the heights, but shm, or shem, was also the root of a word meaning plant or vegetation in the context of the garden in Eden. In the descriptions of this place, which will follow, it is likely that Hashemim originally meant the highlands, acknowledging Paranomasia, the planted highlands in particular. In similar manner, Ha-Eres, which the Jerusalem Bible translates as the earth, is capable of translation as the ground or the land. In contradistinction to Hashemim, Ha-Eres originally probably meant the lowlands. The most important problem in these translations of terms in Genesis, after the elucidation of Elohim, occurs in the Hebrew word bara, which is translated by biblical scholars as created. There would be no reason to challenge this interpretation if it were not for the parallel Sumerian and alternative Hebrew versions which are available. The term bara was only used biblically in the sense of a creation by God. Otherwise, commonly it could mean such disparate things as cut down timber or clear ground or fatten oneself. It follows that the first verse of the first chapter of Genesis should not necessarily be translated as, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," but instead as, "In the beginning, the Shining Ones cleared the ground or felled timber in the highlands and the lowlands," because according to the Sumerian record, that is exactly what the Shining Ones did in the Karsog.